Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me today are Spike deputy editor and host of the Last Orders podcast, Tom Slater.
Hello, hello.
And Spike columnist, Ella Whelan.
Hi.
This week on the show, Brexit, sexual harassment, and Bernie Sanders.
If the House, having rejected leaving with the deal negotiated with the EU, then rejects leaving on the 29th of March without a withdrawal agreement and future framework, the government will, on the 14th of March, bring forward a motion on whether Parliament wants to seek a short, limited extension to Article 50.
Labour will support or put forward an amendment in favour of a public vote.
This week, MPs voted overwhelmingly for safeguards against the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. The Cooper-Bowles amendment will allow MPs a vote on whether to extend the Article 50 negotiating period if Theresa May's deal fails to make it through the House of Commons. Meanwhile, the Labour Party, following a defeat of its proposed Brexit deal, is now backing a second EU referendum. Tom, do you want to tell us a bit more about what's been going on in Parliament this week?
Well, so everything kind of came to a head this week, but probably not in the order in which we thought it was going to happen. I think it's fair to say the two big questions hanging over the process going into this week were, on the one hand, would Theresa May buckle and extend Article 50 to try and take, not necessarily just take no deal off the table, but at least change our exit date from 29th of March, as is currently the default, to push it back a little bit to play for more time. She came under intense pressure from her own cabinet, David Gauke, Amber Rudd, Greg Clark in particular, having been in the papers at the weekend, effectively saying that they would defy her and vote for an extension if her deal was defeated. And the other question was what the Labour Party is going to do, because it's clear that their own Brexit offer, such as it is, doesn't have a majority in Parliament. On paper, they should be moving towards a second referendum, but particularly Corbyn seemed to be very hesitant to move towards that. First of all, on Monday night, you had the Labour Party come out and say that it would move towards supporting a second referendum if its proposed deal fell on Wednesday, which it almost undoubtedly would, and it eventually did. And then the following day, you had Theresa May announce that if her deal failed to pass, then she would allow Parliament to vote on whether or not it wanted to pursue no deal, and if it didn't, then to vote for some form of extension, basically kind of kicking the legs out from under the Cooper-Letwin amendment and effectively creating some sort of guarantee on its own terms. Cooper-Letwin basically got refashioned and passed, but as a kind of reaffirmation of what Theresa May had said, and then Labour's motion on its own deal failed, and therefore it is now, at least in theory, committed to a second referendum on Brexit. So things have really come to a head here. There's still a lot of discussion about what all of this means. Some people on both the Remain and the Brexiteer side suggest that some sort of short extension on Article 50 might not take no deal off the table entirely, especially if it only goes up to just before the European Parliament comes back. That would effectively just move the cliff edge. There's some debate about that. There's some debate about whether or not Labour's policy on the second referendum really means anything, given the fact that there isn't a majority, it seems, at the moment in Parliament for a second referendum, that even die-hard Remainers, many of them are sufficiently spooked. But no matter what, outside of those slightly more technical and tactical discussions, it's very clear which way the wind is blowing. And it does seem like at the moment the people who do have the upper hand are the EU, who either want a far softer deal than we currently have, or for us to just stay back in, and most of Parliament who frankly want basically the same thing. And I think it would be naive to suggest that anything else is likely to come of this week's events.
I mean, one big disappointment has been the sort of slow collapse and folding of the European Research Group, the ERG, the supposedly hardline Brexiteer Tories, because they seem to now be sort of slowly coalescing around May's deal, which, as we know, is just a sort of Brexit in name only. I mean, you have Boris Johnson, who, because of his leadership ambitions being his main focus, doesn't want to be the person that, splits the Tory party by openly pursuing a no-deal option at this point. And even Jacob Rees-Mogg has announced, that he would accept a legally binding appendix to the backstop as a possible solution. So, in other words, even the supposed hardliners are willing to be won over to abandoning Brexit by either EU legalese or just party expediency. So, yeah, not looking good for Brexit.
No, certainly not. I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg even said, I don't care what kind of wording it is, I don't care what form it comes in, just as long as you have some assurance that the backstop isn't going to stop us from unilaterally leaving, then, and that's like it's a real cop-out, because it's like saying that everything is fine with Theresa May's approach and her promise of Brexit and her deal, other than just a few tweaking words which can really come in any form. I mean, that it's not just a case of even just the backstop. There's a huge amount wrong with her deal. I mean, it's fascinating that there's no majority in Parliament for anything other than stopping Brexit, other than stopping a no deal. Well, there's a widespread understanding that people don't want this to continue, whether it be, scare reports about businesses saying they're in limbo, whether it be just voters, expressing distress, saying, why can't they just get on with this? So the idea of a delay, that seems to be very popular in Parliament, is not popular at all outside of the House of Commons. I mean, people genuinely do want the government to just get on with this. The idea of taking no deal off the table completely and either stopping that through a delay and extension to Article 50 or, even as the amendment that got defeated by the SNP, stopping it through any means or under any circumstances is a real travesty and shouldn't be forgotten that what that means is essentially taking Brexit, hard Brexit, clean Brexit, whatever you want to call it, off the table. It means that the only options left are a Remainer-influenced Brexit, which is not one in its entirety. And that is simply undemocratic.
I think the other thing is that we shouldn't get too caught up as well in the technicalities and the arguments that are being made to not recognise the broader dynamics that are going on and what this spells actually for the political parties and how its kind of true essence has been revealed throughout this process. So the Labour U-turn on the second referendum this week, I think, is very, very significant in that regard, because this has been what all of the commentariat have been pushing for, because this is what the People's Vote crew have been pinning all their hopes on. You kind of forget how significant it actually is.
Yeah.
The fact that the party of the people, so-called, is now telling the people that they need to vote again, that the party that's supposed to represent workers is defying millions of workers who voted in the European referendum to leave the European Union. Basically to keep happy an urban middle class who are just deeply unaccustomed to not getting their way. That's really what is going on. I think there's an open question about whether or not Labour's Brexit stance will hurt it electorally. It's not good to make predictions these days, but Richard Johnson at the University of Lancaster has crunched the numbers on this, and he points out 61% of Labour constituencies voted leave, as they currently are. Out of the seats they need to take off the Tories, 78% of them voted leave. And out of the seats of theirs which are most vulnerable, 72% of them voted leave. So these are not encouraging numbers. But even if it does manage to carry on in some form, even if it does manage to just capture and become on some level the party of Remain, the whole point of Labour, which is to, supposedly to put more power in ordinary people's hands, has been entirely inverted by this process. It's been revealed how little claim it has to do that. And whilst for a very long time we've said on Spike that Labour and the Tories were kind of zombie parties who for a long time had failed to actually be what they were set up to be, they're just kind of stumbling on without actually much mission. That's never been more clear this week, particularly in the case of Labour, I don't think. What's
most incredible as well, I mean, we've talked about the split a lot more last week, the MPs defecting to this independent group, is that Labour has actually split up into two parties that are opposed to Brexit. You'd want at least one rump of them to defend something of the democratic vote that we had in 2016.
And Corbyn's Corbyn, the principled politician, the man that's meant to stick to his guns. We've said time and again that on the issue of the EU, he's proven not to be principled. But I mean, there's moments when you think the internet's just such a fantastic resource. There was this video that got pulled up and shared on Twitter of him addressing no voters at an anti-Lisbon Treaty rally in Ireland in 2009. When he's sort of kind of, sniggering and saying, oh, don't recycle your posters because I think they're just going to make you vote again and again and again until they get their answer. And you think, what's changed in 10 years from your position then, which was anti-EU and completely astute in seeing what EU and political establishments do to get their way, and now when you are on their side. So it's worth remembering that when the chips are down, Corbyn does not prove himself to be the man that he says he is. He has no principles in relation to this.
I'd just like to take a really quick moment to say a massive thank you to everyone who's been donating to Spiked. I know many of you who listen to this podcast have donated to us in the past or make monthly donations, and it's thanks to your contributions and generosity that we can keep going and growing. Spiked has some very exciting plans for the year ahead with our podcasts, and we need the help of listeners and readers like you to make them happen. So, if you haven't before, please do consider making a donation, or even better, setting up a monthly donation. It's really easy to do. Just go to spiked-online.com and click the red donate button in the top right corner. Thank you. Now, back to the show. A new report claims that more than half of UK university students are being exposed to unwanted sexual behaviours. Student unions have long claimed that there is a so-called rape culture on British campuses. But Ella, what's the truth behind this latest survey?
Well, as always with these kind of surveys, it isn't necessarily what it seems. I think if you genuinely believed that half of students at UK universities were suffering from some kind of, terrible sexual assault or harassment, you would expect there to be marches in the street, because that's a very big number. Obviously, the fact is this survey asked about unwanted sexual behaviour, which you try and tell me what that means. I mean, anyone could come up with 100 different descriptions of that, but it included things like inappropriate touching, explicit messages, being catcalled, and then also being followed or being forced into sex or sexual acts. Very serious things alongside arguably quite trivial issues. And some of the stats that they came up with, again, when you look at really what they're actually telling you, it doesn't tell you very much. So it said that 56% experienced unwanted sexual behaviour, but only 15% realised that this counted as harassment. Now, that is such a fascinating statement if you break it down, because it said in another place only 15% believed that they were a victim. Well, of course, believing that you're a victim is completely subjective. Whether or not the behaviour or the attention that you've received is criminal, harassment or assault, that's a completely different subject. It also stated that 30% of all the incidents that it asked people about took place on campus. That means that 70% of them happened out in the town or somewhere that's nothing to do with the universities. And buried right at the end of all of the press releases was the brilliant stat that 90% of all students surveyed felt confident to say no to unwanted sexual advances. So what's the problem? What is the problem? If the vast majority of students feel confident in asserting themselves in sexual relationships, what is the issue?
That's fascinating, and one of the disparities just of the statistics you read that raised alarm bells in my mind. 15% of people think they're a victim, but the assumption is that actually the 85% are wrong. That they are victims and they don't even realise it. That these people don't know their own minds, and then again, only 8% are reporting, as if 100% should be reporting every single thing that happens to them. You do have to take a step back and think, do the people, who organise and orchestrate these surveys, have they ever had any kind of relationships or sex life? Because, how on earth do you know an advance is going to be unwanted before you make it? Unless it's obviously pervy and weird and lewd and disgusting.
Yeah. But without wanting to kind of impute motives, they are fundamentally interested in inflating the statistics. That's just the nature of these things, really. Unfortunately, and you even see things creep into the mix, like I can't remember the precise statistic, maybe you do, Ella, but about the number of women respondents who didn't realise that being drunk meant that they couldn't consent.
It said only 52% of people realised that.
That completely puts the cat amongst pigeons in terms of what it is we're supposed to actually be talking about here. Now, it's really important that people are sceptical of these kinds of statistics, not because, just for the hell of it, but because you can have very serious consequences to dodgy statistics, and they end up with bad policies, bad outcomes, bad ideas. And I think even the fact that currently we're talking about over 50% of people experiencing some form of sexual assault or sexual harassment. And talking about kind of dodgy statistics, I remember a couple of years ago looking into what the NUS was then claiming in the Hidden Marks report, that 1 in 7 people were subject to some sort of physical and sexual assault. They had to clump those two things together in order to get to that statistic. And it actually turned out that the biggest category within that was hair pulling and slapping. It didn't even stipulate who was committing those kinds of offences. And it's a really important but sometimes difficult point to make, which is that a real barrier, it feels like, to women's freedom, particularly in relation to the campus discussion today, is not the fact that they have freedom, not the fact that they're allowed to kind of run around and things might happen. It's the fact that they're being terrified, or at least people are trying to terrify them into suggesting that they're far more a threat than they actually are. And that can have real consequences. We've seen in America the kind of response to the kind of campus sexual assault hysteria in the form of these kangaroo courts, creating, both very unjust and sometimes very bizarre situations where students are being expelled for no good reason. We've seen that beginning to be exported over here recently, particularly University of Cambridge have been agitating for the burden of proof in campus sexual assault proceedings to be lowered to the balance of probabilities. It's currently beyond reasonable doubt, even conceding the idea that it's the role of a campus board appointed of a couple of lecturers and administrators to actually rule on a crime as serious as sexual assault. So these statistics really do need to be called more into question, because there's obviously things wrong with them. And if you just take them wholesale, you're going to end up going down some really dark paths, frankly.
It's that kind of disparity between the seriousness of the allegation and the proposed response that always makes me question: are we really talking about rape? Are we really talking about sexual assault? Because, as you say, if we were talking about serious crimes, is expulsion an appropriate punishment? I don't think it is.
Just keep them off campus.
Is that really all you're going to do if someone was sexually assaulted? No. So clearly, we know we're talking about something else, something a bit less serious, maybe.
But also on a broader political point for what this means for women, I think this is why I'm so dedicated to trashing these kind of stats. Not because, as often gets levelled at you, that you're sort of unsympathetic towards people's experiences of, sexual harassment, sexual assault, or even when men piss women off. Like I'm not saying that we should have to put up with that. But this kind of fear-mongering completely strips women of their agency. I mean, it's worth going back to that stat about alcohol. Because essentially I rang up a barrister friend of mine and said, is there anything in the law that says that if you are drunk that you cannot consent? He said, no, there's no hard rule on it. Obviously, juries can decide that if someone is incapacitated and paralytic, then it's quite clear that you're raping them if you're having sex with them and they can't say yes or they can't participate. But the idea that if you're drunk, you can't consent, well, that means that once a woman consumes alcohol, whether that's 1 pint or 5, she is then reduced to the status of a child. She's absolutely no control over her decisions, over her body. And that's what a lot of these stats are saying, is that men are predators and women are the victims, and women are completely incapable of dealing with this in any way other than seeing themselves as a victim and reporting it to the police. I mean, that means that we are back to the kind of 19th century view of women as having to be chaperoned around because we can't take control of our own lives. I don't think people realise how extremely reactionary that is. And on the basis of sexual freedom, it was the Brooke charity who did this survey. Helen Brooke was someone who set up the charity back in the 60s in order to teach unmarried women about pregnancy, about contraception, about how they could manage their sexual lives in a more free way. I think it's really telling that now, fast forward to 2019, it's using these kind of stats to terrify women about their sexual freedom.
Hi there. I hope you're enjoying the Spike podcast so far. And if you are, why not help us spread the word by giving us a rating and a review with your podcast provider? It won't take long, but it will make a huge difference for us. So we'd be massively grateful if you could take a tiny bit of your time to give us a rating and a review. Right, now back to the show. Bernie Sanders has thrown his hat in the ring for the 2020 presidential race. His presidential bid has already raised $10 million, outraising a crowded field of Democratic rivals. A lifelong outsider is now the frontrunner. Tom, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the most fascinating thing with Bernie is the excitement that he generates amongst sections of the public, sections of the Democratic base certainly, and the disdain that he's greeted with by the Democratic establishment is absolutely fascinating. The kind of really, largely speaking, kind of identity politics focused backlash to him, which is so incredibly petty. So when he announced on Vermont Public Radio that he was going to run, and he kind of came up against this question that was levelled at him after 2016 about, really is an old white guy effectively the person who should be leading this movement forward, particularly with Trump in the White House now. He effectively repeated the Martin Luther King point. We've got to get beyond talking about people in terms of, their immutable characteristics. This is about the ideas and what they stand for. And once again, he was pilloried for saying this. Rich Lowry wrote a good piece about this where he's talking, and he quoted some people. Stephen Colbert snarking, yes, like Dr. King, I have a dream where this diverse nation can come together and be led by an old white guy. Various people saying that it was effectively just bad taste in the current climate to suggest that we should be trying to move beyond race. And this is something that has really been interesting in the battle between the kind of slightly more populist, supposedly democratic socialists, although we might want to debate that nature of the kind of Sanders camp, and the Democratic establishment, which whilst being thoroughly elite, whilst being full of funding from some of the richest sections of America, has always used identity politics as a way to kind of try and beat down the left of the party, or at least has certainly been doing that in the last couple of years. The sad thing is that it seems like Bernie has been capitulating to it a little bit. He put out, Michael Tracy wrote about this on Spike this week, he put out a kind of warning to the so-called Bernie bros, this kind of complete invention of the sort of democratic establishment. Supposedly these blokes online who were shouting down women because so blinded by their love of Bernie Sanders. He told them to calm it down. He's even admitted that, he needs to run a slightly less kind of pale male and stale campaign. But I think the more he does that, the more he's going to switch off the people who he can reach, and most of the other Democratic candidates can't, who are people who are actually pretty fed up with that kind of identity politics nonsense, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, in that interview with the Young Turks, where he said that, he said, oh yeah, the campaign before was too white and too male orientated. When they asked him, who are you thinking for, vice president? He said, well, I think we could look for somebody who's maybe not of the same gender as I am, and maybe somebody a couple of years younger than me. I mean, so it's like, but it's funny, but also the problem is, alongside that, he's also doing the whole kind of, really going for Trump, saying that he wrote in The Guardian this week that he's a bigot, a liar, a fraud, a racist, a sexist, a xenophobe. So that's his shtick, that he really goes for Trump. And I mean, the fact is that America is still really quite divided over Trump in many ways. And so echoing that kind of anti-Trump and anti-Trump voter rhetoric of sort of just labeling the bigot word onto anything that's related to him isn't going to win people over to him. And I think part of the problem is that he does need to win, or certainly the Democrats do need to win over those Trump voters. You're not going to do that by continuously taking that line. Having said that, I mean, Trump has on several occasions proven to be perhaps not an outright bigot, but certainly some of those things that Sanders is calling him. I mean, the other problem is that though he's had a lot of flack for being the kind of the white male pale stale whatever, I think that the things that he's putting forward aren't necessarily bad. So, I mean, his policies on healthcare are certainly very attractive. The issues of scrapping tuition-free fees is going to be popular among many people in America. But it's largely seems to be still at the moment subject to the kind of pie in the sky criticisms in terms of his continuously going on about democratic socialism. If you mention the S word in America, it gets people's backs up. That doesn't mean that he should stop doing it.
Yeah, I mean, read the New York Times. They said he was something like a quasi-Marxist, relatively hard left. These kinds of bizarre, completely bizarre buzz phrases for a politician that would not look out of place in any mainstream European political party.
He basically wants America to be Sweden. That's basically what he wants to do, kind of Swedish social democracy. It does speak to how narrow the political debate, particularly on economics, is in America, that you have that, that kind of there is no alternative is so writ large. But one of the things that is interesting, kind of keeping on the economics thing and the kind of elite policies which have been pushed by both the Democrats and the Republicans for so long, is how people like Hillary Clinton have been able to kind of pose as radical, if anything more radical than their more economically populist colleagues by playing on identity politics. And I think it does come back to a point that we've made many times, which is identity politics can be a very convenient cover for real privilege. Banging on about privilege all day can be a very real cover for not talking about real economic privileges and for how those things might be redressed. None of this is to say that Bernie Sanders is necessarily this revolutionary who's going to make everything wonderful in America, but nevertheless, I think the nature of the response to him tells you everything you need to know, not just about the narrowness of the debate, not just about how identity politics is frankly just an elite weapon at this point, but basically just how resistant a lot of the political establishment is to change, even to something as inoffensive as kind of Swedish social democracy.
Things have really, really ramped up in the sort of identity politics stakes. And one example just shows how crazy things have become is the Kamala Harris, who's a black woman, has now been questioned about her choice of husband, who is white. The insinuation being that she is not potentially black enough to be black. I mean, it's not only that identity politics is a cover for elite policies and as you're saying, but it can actually lead down some very dark roads. To a re-racializing of politics. It's kind of a pork barrel politics of the 21st century in a way, and that's, I think, something that needs to be confronted head on. Bernie is doing a good job of occasionally confronting these things, but he also looks as if he's conceding a bit to it too.
Well, I think he also does recognise on some level at least his most diehard supporters do come from the identity politics set. I remember when me and Nella were in the US during the primaries way back in 2016, and going to a Trump rally outside was an anti-Trump protest, but it was basically a pro-Bernie protest. You could barely, the chants waxed and waned from one to the other. And there was a lot of blue hair there, just to be real. And I think he does recognise that whilst he can appeal, I think, and I think this has been well established, to the kind of Obama-Trump voters, those people in blue states who, despite voting Democratic their entire lives, suddenly saw something in Trump and his populist economic message. But at the same time, he does owe a lot of his dynamism to the identity politics set, and that is going to be a tension I'm not sure if he can fully resolve, frankly.
And to the Democratic Socialists of America, that kind of grouping who we've discussed are, actually quite affluent, university educated, not really representative of the workers that they claim to represent.
Remember one of the other front runners, Elizabeth Warren, talking about back in January, talking about how terrible it was that her likability ratings were down, and people even suggesting that it was sexist because she was seen as cold and aloof in the same way that Clinton was. And so there's this tension where they're always playing kind of two games, which is one, say the right thing to the right kind of voters. Back in 2016, when me and Tom were there, we also went to a Hillary Clinton rally, which was in the heart.
Dampest thing I've ever seen.
It was the dampest thing, and it was the most awkward thing because it was so obvious that she was trying to kiss ass to black voters in this really crude and insulting kind of a way. That hasn't necessarily gone away. I think Sanders is doing a lot of that, in all his speeches, one that he gave the CNN town hall one earlier this week. He starts off by saying we have to tackle the racism, sexism, homophobia, blah, 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 the list goes on in this country. One of the things he had going for him was that he was sort of seen as the old socialist granddad who, wasn't too concerned about all of this, but just wanted to get democratic socialism in place in America. If he sticks to that, as Michael Tracy says in Spiked, potentially he might succeed, and I wouldn't mind seeing him succeed. But if he continues going down this identity politics road, he's just going to trip himself up because he isn't an identity politics kind of guy.
Yeah. You've been listening to the Spike podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, don't forget to give us a rating, a review, or even make a donation. We'll be back next week, but for more Spike content every day, visit spiked-online.com.